5 public order.
Okay, I'm just going to check the handcuffs. Thank you. Did you remove the handcuffs or whatever? No.
Did you want me to?
Okay, and what are the circumstances of arrest?
Circumstances are I'm driving a police vehicle on Church Street, Lancashire Major. Past Mr. Kirk, who made an abusive gesture towards myself and Susie Holmes.
Yeah.
I stopped, told Mr. Kirk I would not tolerate abuse in the street from him. I gave him an official public order warning, section 5.
Yeah.
He replied by saying, "You're a fucking skunk," and was subsequently arrested. Significant statement after caution. You are a fucking bastard.
That was it. And he was arrested and then a caution applied. Did you reply?
You're a fucking bastard. Might be pertinent to note on the custody record that in the street he shouted out to people outside the Tudor Tavern, "I will pay £50 to anyone who's informed as a witness," which he upped to £100, 200 and then 500. And subsequently, there were plenty of people outside the Tudor Tavern willing to take his offer. His wife was at the scene and has taken a lot of Mr. Kirk's property after cursory searches.
Which included a large amount of money.
Related to the handcuffs, the reason for them being used?
When Mr. Kirk was thought he was arrested, sent up, backed up against the wall and resisted being moved towards the police station. He was handcuffed by myself and Susie Holmes to the front. And whilst P.T. Holmes attempted to adjust the handcuffs to the correct and comfortable position, the defendant, the detained person, kicked out and further resisted P.T. Holmes. He restrained him across the bonnet of the vehicle.
It's got together and written on notebooks by now, I hope.
The van was called for. He took out a light and conveyed the detained person to Barry Police Station.
Another day off from me.
As custody officer, it's my duty to consider the circumstances of any case brought before me, to decide firstly whether there is sufficient evidence to charge the person arrested with a reasonable prospect of a conviction in court. Having listened to what Principal Kilberger said to me, I'm satisfied there is sufficient evidence to charge you, and I authorise your detention here as I believe it's necessary to do so to charge you and to bring you before the court at the most appropriate opportunity.
You mean you're refusing me bail to attend court? No.
What's the time of arrest?
1930. Church Street, 100 metres.
Can I just have a few minutes to see what it is, so I can find the injuries? Do you have any injuries other than what I just looked at?
What, from tonight?
No at all. So I need to be aware of in relation to your health and safety whilst you're here.
How long am I going to be here?
I don't know at this moment.
Oh. You can't tell me how long I'm going to be here. I can't really assess the interest that you may have in my
Okay.
injuries.
Do you suffer with any illnesses or do you need any medication while you're here?
I need to see a doctor.
Okay, in relation to what?
That's enough for me.
And your surname?
Gilbert has all the details. But I am
Gentleman's surname?
Kirk.
First name?
Maurice John.
Date of birth, Mr. Kirk?
Kilberg knows that as well.
Kirk's date of birth is 12345. The address is the market.
Not at the moment, because we've been something if you could give us a call back in about 15 minutes time, I think that's enough. Okay? Well, okay?
And what would the address again?
The market, St. Donald.
Okay. No, 01446
M-E-L-L?
731
July. St. Donald.
Well, it's interesting, you have certain rights. You have the right to speak to an independent solicitor free of charge. You have the right to have somebody told if you've been arrested. You have the right to consult a copy of the code of practice covering police powers and procedures. You may do any of these things now, but if you don't, you may still go through at any other time whilst you're detained at the police station. There is a form outlining your rights. Would you like a solicitor?
Not at the moment.
Would you like somebody told that you've been arrested?
Not at the moment.
Kirk, I needed to probably copy up on the desk there from this week. And include any belts you really want that you have on you.
You're going to take it from me to prevent any loss or damage to the property or any harm after you. Okay? No, I'm not going to put a copy up on this.
Could you read the custody of the case?
Would you mind just doing it?
I'll ask you again, Mr. Kirk, could you put the copy up on the desk there for me, please?
Mr. Kirk, I'm a custody officer. Police and Criminal Evidence Act states that I have a duty to ascertain what property the detained person has on them when they enter into custody. That is a duty placed on me by the Police and Criminal Evidence Act. Section 170 of that Act states that any power or duty outlined in that Act can be carried out without consent and with enough force as is necessary to complete the task. I need to ascertain what property you have on you, and I need to ascertain whether or not you keep that. Would you like to put the property you have in your pocket onto the counter, please? Okay, Bob?
You stand and take me, Mr. Kirk. Thank you very much. I'll put your hands to your side. I'm going to tap you out first of all, and I'll make a more detailed search.
going on from here?
Take your tile, just one quick. Also maybe wash off a little. That's one thing, you just don't take again. Just want to show you that I met the food on the That's fine, thank you very much. That's all we got here.
And the belt, the tool in the case.
Wait, sorry. Watch. One gate, please. Two buttons in plastic. Right. On the feet.
We have the receiver. We have the receiver.
Where is that? £120 note.
Yeah.
150 pence piece. 4 cents pence pieces. 30 pence in silver. And tuppence in
Take a look at the box.
That's what's in the drawer now.
ask you for some signatures, Mr. Kirk. Would you settle to the counter, please? Mr. Kirk. Kirk. Okay, to number 7 then.
Okay. Kirk, come on to the next bit. There's no recording of that.
Hello, and in this week's live look at justice and the law, the legal vultures gathered to pick over the corpse of the Union Carbide catastrophe. How did the lawyers assess the price of human life? Why could it be $1 billion for a death in Bhopal, but £3,500 if you're killed in Britain?
And we look at the quirkiest jurisdiction in the British Isles, why Jersey and Guernsey are a law unto themselves, and why a man is starving to death to prove that Channel Island law is no joke if you care about justice.
Some people may sense the sniff of the Middle Ages about the legal system here.
17th, 18th century, perhaps, yes. I think that perhaps in some ways Guernsey does need to be dragged screaming into the 20th century.
And Britain's newest prison, why after 35 years of dithering, the Home Office has come up with the wrong prison in the wrong place for the wrong sort of prisoner.
As the panic spreads, Bhopal in the state of Madhya Pradesh is the city of the blind, and through its alleys stalk a legion of lawyers, anxious to secure for the survivors the maximum damages for the Union Carbide catastrophe. Their motives are mixed. For every $1 million successfully sued for, they stand to gain up to $250,000. Under the contingency fees system, American lawyers take a percentage of the damages they win for their clients.
It's a system that's been much criticised in Britain. There's the obvious incentive for lawyers to claim astronomical sums in damages in the hope of huge commissions. On the other hand, the client enjoys the certain knowledge that the lawyer has a personal interest in winning him the biggest possible settlement. The last time there was a comparable catastrophe involving lawsuits in American courts was the DC-10 air disaster of 1974. A Turkish airliner built in America crashed in France on its way to Britain. American attorneys advised the relatives of the 346 dead to sue the plane makers on the grounds that the DC-10 aircraft had inherent design faults. The settlement ran into millions of dollars. Had it been a British airliner, the damages would have been severely limited to a matter of thousands of dollars a family.
That's because in America, damages are assessed on a much wider brief than they are in Britain, and the same would be true if the Bhopal litigants are successful in the American courts. If the DC-10 litigation is anything to go by, American lawyers will now be busy compiling dossiers like this one, compiled for a family who lost a parent to the air crash. The document, in which we've changed the names to save the family any distress, is the basis of the claim for damages. It starts with a brief summary of the family before the disaster. It then quantifies the economic loss suffered by the family as the result of the crash. The rows of figures assess the potential earning power of the dead person, the cost of extra domestic help, the economic dependency of each child on the deceased. And the sum in this case for economic loss came to $212,405.
But more important for the DC-10 families and for the Bhopal victims is a section on indirect, non-economic loss. This, quite bluntly, is the price of love. The appendix assesses the value of the love, affection, care, attention, companionship, comfort, protection and society of the deceased. In this particular case, it was assessed for the surviving spouse on the basis of $10,000 a year for a 25-year expectation of life. The figure is adjusted for the surviving children, and the total cost of lost love is assessed at $331,243.50. Add the economic loss to the non-economic loss, take off a third by way of a compromise, and the figure eventually claimed for in this one case of the DC-10 disaster was $425,000. Some claims were much higher. 7 families were awarded £1 million apiece by a court in Chicago.
In Bhopal, American lawyers won't be able to claim much for economic loss. Wages in India are low. What they'll really be claiming for is the non-economic loss. The price, as one lawyer said, of a cupful of tears, as valuable in Bhopal as in West Virginia. Maybe it's crude, distasteful and arbitrary to place a value on lost love and present grief. Yet how do our own courts in Britain assess the value of a lost loved one?
Under the Fatal Accidents Act of 1976, a bereaved family may be entitled to compensation for economic loss, the breadwinner's loss of earnings after an accident caused by negligence. But Parliament has set the price of grief at £3,500. In this respect, our law is curiously passionless, as Lord Wright observed in a fatal accident case.
There is no question here of what might be called sentimental damages, bereavement or pain and suffering. It is a hard matter of pounds, shillings and pence, subject to the element of reasonable future probabilities.
So in 1974, when the Nipro works blew up at Flixborough and 28 people were killed.
Tomorrow in the small Channel Island of Guernsey, a man serving a sentence of 8 months for contempt of court will enter the 50th day of a hunger strike, a dramatic protest against a drastic sentence, and the only way, he feels, to bring the public attention to the extraordinary state of law and justice on the island.
Although the Channel Islands are the responsibility of the British Crown, Guernsey is quite literally a law unto itself. No one's even sure what that law actually is. It's based on 1,000-year-old feudal Norman codes, and it's never been officially codified. There may not even be an offence of contempt of court. There's certainly no law of habeas corpus as we understand that cornerstone of common law. Island justice is equally antique, equally doubtful. There's only one jury on the island, men only, and it's elected by the Guernsey Parliament, a crucial confusion of legal and executive powers.
Especially contentious are the island's housing laws. Unless you're very rich or important to the community, newcomers are restricted in the choice of where they live. You can buy a house anywhere on the island, but that doesn't necessarily mean you'll be allowed to live in it. At the moment, the European Commission on Human Rights is investigating the matter. What with that and the hunger strike, the ancient mysteries of Channel Island law are under embarrassing and unprecedented scrutiny. Ed Boyle went to Guernsey to see if he could sort it out.
November 84. Guernsey's prison authorities transfer a sick inmate to hospital. He's refused all food since October the 24th. Today, their most embarrassing convict won't take liquids either. A strike to the death, he claims, for British legal rights in a British island. We weren't allowed to speak to Mr. Maurice Kirk, but 6 weeks of self-imposed starvation have left their mark. He's unable to get out of bed, and his unkempt appearance disguises the character he is. Kirk was nicknamed the Flying Vet, a flamboyant Brit who's now serving the longest sentence in living memory for contempt of court. He flew in the face of authority, and in Guernsey, the penalties for doing that can be very high.
Would Master Lester Le Gallion recently arrived from the mainland? Please call at the Tourist Information Desk.
Mr. Lester Le Gallion won't do anything of the kind if he's sensible. It's a false name anyway, it has to be. For Spencer Gelthorpe is another victim of Guernsey law, liable to arrest for the crime of attempting to live in his own house. These strange legal ripples will probably pass unnoticed by the majority of visitors. Guernsey's compensations are opulent and obvious. Picture postcard Britain, outside the grasp of the Treasury. Boat owners boast the tax advantages and the methods they sometimes use to cash in on them. St. Peter Port bustles with holidaymakers clutching their duty-free. Commerce, after all, is the island's lifeblood. Income tax at 20 pence in the pound, unemployment negligible, and the high streets sporting the spoils of a thriving economy. Choosy depositors from the mainland can take their pick, byways bristling with banks. Too good to be true? Not while Royal Charter allows the local parliament to fix the taxes. For money talks in Guernsey, only the less well-off may find their entry restricted. Which is why Spencer Gelthorpe now visits the island furtively. This was his home for 11 years. His wife is a schoolteacher, a job which carried a residential license. But when the family briefly left Guernsey, they returned to find the license withdrawn and their right to occupy this house removed. Ironic that the place was sold in the name of providing a much-needed house for a native Guernseyman, for its new local owner actually lives and works in Belgium, but the law protects him. In Mr. Gelthorpe's case, however, the police were sent to shadow the family night and day.
I believe that they were doing their job for the housing authority to ascertain occupation. But I don't think it needed 7 weeks to do that. And at night, the police opened the letterbox to ascertain whether we were in occupation and also shine torches at the windows. My daughters have been wakened by high-powered torches.
What were they doing?
They were trying to frighten us, I believe.
But like German invaders before him, Mr. Gelthorpe fortified his case to live in Guernsey. His new home even has a backyard bunker. What the man and his family still lack, however, is a license to live here. Spencer Gelthorpe believes the housing law denies him basic human rights, for by putting the key in his own front door, he's a technical criminal.
I think I am. There would possibly be extenuating circumstances to include you or exclude you from the housing laws, because you've lived in England possibly for the past 12 months, but I certainly would be breaking the law.
What could they do to you?
They could prosecute, they could fine, and eventually, if the worst comes to worst, they have it within their powers to take this house and sell it at its original value, whatever that was, whenever we bought it, and deduct the fine, possibly a £5,000 fine.
Mere pocket money to the tax millionaires, but a very effective way of keeping out the less well-off. And no coincidence, perhaps, that the housing authority looks more like an immigration office. A very odd housing law, too, some people might think.
I'm sure it might, but if they knew the facts, I'm sure it wouldn't.
Do you not have draconian housing laws here?
No, I'm sure we haven't. We have a law that was updated in 1982, administered by the Housing Authority, of which I'm president, and we administered this law with compassion and very much on humanitarian grounds.
What we're trying to do with the housing control law is to have a fair system of control on the occupation of houses in this island, so that the Guernsey people are not driven out by inflation in house prices, by general pressure from people coming in. And we have, over the years, evolved, I think, a much fairer system than we had in the years immediately after the war.
But there are still two classes of houses, local restricted properties and open market, the freedom of the island if you've got the cash. For in Guernsey, an Englishman's home has to be a very expensive castle indeed, £100,000 plus. Then the authorities welcome you. No need here for an essential job and a residential license earned over 15 years, which you would otherwise need in the restricted market. But this estate is quite beyond the means of Spencer Gelthorpe, and the law says he isn't allowed to live anywhere else either.
Just look at it very simply, that I bought a house legally through the courts that I cannot live in. If that makes sense to you, it doesn't make sense to me.
But Guernsey's hybrid legal system often fails to make sense to outsiders, mimicking the mainland with its allegiance to the crown, but using peculiar Norman French traditions of justice too. This is the seat of the judicial power. But don't expect to meet a normal jury here or get legal aid. British to look at, but deceptive.
Guernsey's legal complexities are totally compounded in this building, which looks like an ordinary council chamber, but is in fact both the state's parliament of the island and also the Royal Court of Justice. The man who sits in this chair, the bailiff, isn't just the bailiff, he's also the Speaker of the Parliament.
Which means that the men who make the laws are frequently the same as the men who enforce them, a power structure arguably open to abuse. And it's precisely this argument that has led Maurice Kirk, a local vet, to his prison hunger strike. Even his wife Janet can't set up home on the island because of the housing laws. But Maurice Kirk is driven by much wider legal horizons than simply that.
If he feels that he is after something that he's rightfully entitled to, he does not give up easily.
Some people have described him to us as a little bit eccentric.
And he does tend to have sometimes a flamboyant way of going about things.
Maurice Kirk has been a thorn in the side of Guernsey's administrators for 3 years. But the writing was on the wall for him almost as soon as he put it there. Guernsey doesn't cherish criticism, not of the public kind that Maurice Kirk frequently doles out. His brushes with the law were always designed for maximum publicity. Aloft here from the port cranes, for instance, in a demonstration that brought out the fire brigade to try and bring him down.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen.
Guernsey has tried to drown out Maurice Kirk's protests ever since. It shouldn't, they will tell you privately, have happened to a vet. A vet now sentenced to 8 months for contempt of court. He tried, incidentally, to arrest a magistrate. He's now risking his life for justice.
I think that he's done a very useful job, even if many of the facets of his case have no basis. The points that he has raised about the Guernsey legal system are certainly quite genuine points, and points that need to be considered and points that need to be acted upon.
For in Guernsey, even the basic right of habeas corpus is in question, uncertain under the unwritten laws. Some say it's a thoroughly tacky system, an anachronism in miniature, with a miniature prison for those who breach the minutiae of the law. But for Maurice Kirk, there's a touch of the Enid Blytons about it all.
Toy Town is another way he describes it.
Toy Town? Why Toy Town? What's the similarity?
Well, Noddyland, Toy Town. That all these characters on this little island feel they are very self-important, and he feels they're not conducting their business in the way they should.
A casual observer might be forgiven for getting an impression of the absurd as Her Majesty's Procurer heads for his desk. Procurer, Attorney General and Public Prosecutor rolled into one. For doubling up on the legal jobs is second nature in Guernsey. But answering the grumbles of Maurice Kirk is very definitely not.
I cannot really comment on the current case of the man starving himself to death. The only thing I would say is that that man is a prisoner like any other prisoner. If he chooses to starve himself to death, that is most regrettable. I don't believe he will starve himself to death, and I don't think that there is anything unusual in that case at all, and he is a serving convicted prisoner.
But the Kirk case has always been unusual to outsiders, ever since his veterinary partnership was sold without his agreement, and ever since he tried to stop it by invoking Guernsey's answer to an injunction. This is where Maurice Kirk's bizarre legal problems on Guernsey first started, outside what was then his own veterinary clinic. He raised his first clamour de haro. And if you don't know what that means, let me show you. It is slightly strange. The plaintiff has to kneel on the ground and utter in front of witnesses these words. Haro, 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 allez mon prince, on me fait tort.
It does seem a bit strange. Yes, I have witnessed the clamour de haro being done, and it is rather difficult for somebody who's not fully knowledgeable of the French language, but it doesn't make it impossible to raise the clamour.
Some people may scent the sniff of the Middle Ages about the legal system here.
17th, 18th century, perhaps. Yes, I think that perhaps in some ways Guernsey does need to be dragged screaming into the 20th century.
But the people who will resist change include the mass of registered companies for whom Guernsey's laws provide protection and freedom from mainland taxes, the very people with the cash to buy in on the open market.
I think the island would be in a very poor state, financially and in many other ways, if we didn't have the open market residents. Not only do they contribute to the wealth of the island, the well-being of the island, but many of them contribute a great deal socially.
Guernsey is far from apologetic. Guernsey wants to stay as it is, answerable only to itself, and content to let Britain turn a traditional blind eye. What do you think of the role of the British government in all this?
The British government are ultimately responsible for this law, in as much as the law is made in the islands and passed to the Privy Council for ratification. So somebody looks at it in Great Britain, somebody somewhere should look at it and think, well, are these humane laws? Are they can we uphold these? Are they reasonably fair? What we're doing to British people in the Channel Islands, is it fair? And somebody obviously says yes, and go ahead and ratify it. So they are ultimately responsible for the good governing of this island.
And somehow reneging on their responsibility?
Exactly.
Mr. Foulkes, you've long taken an interest in Guernsey law. How much responsibility should we be taking, given that Guernsey is part of the British Isles?
I think we should be taking a great deal more than the present government is willing to do. First of all, the Prime Minister, in a written answer to me, indicated quite clearly that the UK Parliament has ultimate, paramount responsibility for Guernsey, Jersey and the Isle of Man. And indeed this was confirmed by the Royal Commission on the Constitution under Lord Kilbrandon. So it's only by convention that Guernsey, Jersey and the Isle of Man are internally self-governing, and in a large number of things, including as the signatory on the European Convention on Human Rights. It's the United Kingdom government which acts on behalf of the islands.
But surely it is a small island. We should allow them to run their own affairs as they wish.
Yes, and we do, and that's part of the convention, and as long as they're carrying on in a responsible manner and not infringing things which we are responsible for, then of course we would all be very happy to see them doing that. But there are a number of ways that they're now interfering with what's happening in the United Kingdom. One of them is the tax laws, where they're encouraging people to hop off to the islands to evade United Kingdom taxation. Another is the current questions on the housing laws that we saw in the film, where individuals are taking Guernsey to the European Court of Human Rights. Now, Britain is the signatory on behalf of Guernsey, and if the European Court of Human Rights finds in favour of the individual, then it's us who has to do something about it in the United Kingdom Parliament. So it's ultimately our responsibility.
But as far as the housing law is concerned, can you blame them for putting the natives first? It is, as I said, a very small island.
I don't, no, and that part of it is understandable. What I don't like, and what I think the British government shouldn't like, is the fact that it's okay for non-Guernsey people to go to Guernsey as long as you've got the money, plenty of money. But other people are only encouraged to go only insofar as they can act as servants or provide facilities for the rich. The encouragement is there for rich people to go, and it's the same with Jersey and the Isle of Man, and that isn't fair, and it isn't equal, and it is something that the United Kingdom should be concerned about.
What about Maurice Kirk's situation? He tried to arrest a magistrate. What's important about that case?
It's a very difficult case. There are a lot of ramifications in it, and I wouldn't want to go into every aspect of it, but I think it's important in a number of ways. First of all, in the course of his case, a number of anomalies have come out where it's been clear that Guernsey law is deficient, and where he's challenged Guernsey law in relation to transcripts of evidence, in relation to whether or not there's a contempt of court in Guernsey law, and the clear fact that there's no codified law in Guernsey, and therefore it's very difficult for individuals to know exactly what the law is on a particular subject. And the establishment seems to decide to follow Britain or England in some cases when it's appropriate, and not when it's not appropriate. And when it's not codified, then the individual can't challenge that. Another example recently, I wrote to the bailiff asking for leniency for Maurice Kirk. I wrote to him as head of the administration in Guernsey, but he was also one of the judges who heard Maurice Kirk's appeal. And there's this incestuous relationship between the judiciary, the legislature, and indeed the financial section in Guernsey, Jersey, and in the Isle of Man.
Mr. Falk, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
In a drab corner of agricultural East Yorkshire called Full Sutton, the Home Office is building the prison that nobody seems to need. They've spent
3 years. 44-year-old David Archer pleaded guilty to escaping from custody and refusing to provide a blood sample under the island's drink-drive laws. The court heard that Archer has already drafted a letter of resignation after almost 23 years of service. A man's ear was partially severed in a fight near Jersey's La Folly Inn late as a veterinary surgeon. If he fails to satisfy the authority, it could have a direct bearing on his housing licence, allowing him to occupy property in St Martin's. Jersey police are considering setting up a small police station in the centre of St